Greetings, citizens of Earth. I have travelled from Proxima Centauri b with a message for Mr. Mouth, the green ideologist. But first, excuse me while I change into my cartoon aspect. This will engender regeneration after my long interstellar journey to Earth. Hello, citizens. I am Captain Transformus, a modest corrective to that great foghorn of fashionable despair, Mr. Mouth. Naturally, I too possess a mouth, but in my case it is under the partial supervision of theory, criticism, and the occasional collision with reality. Mr. Mouth tells us that the world is running out of resources, running out of possibilities, running out of excuses for not handing power to people like Mr. Mouth. He imagines nature as a fixed cupboard, humanity as a swarm of greedy hands, and civilization as a regrettable incident in the history of degeneration. But there is another view, a better view, and I think a truer one. It is developed in Ray Scott Percival's paper, The Metaphysics of Scarcity. From that title, one might expect a gloomy sermon on limits. But in spirit it could almost as well have been called The Metaphysics of Never-Ending Abundance. The central point is this: a natural resource is not merely a lump of stuff lying around in nature. A resource is matter interpreted, transformed, and made useful by knowledge. A stone is not yet a resource in the full economic sense, nor is oil, uranium, copper, sunlight, or empty space. Resources are matter transformed by knowledge. Yes, behold the power of theory. They become resources when human beings invent theories, techniques, tools, institutions, and purposes that reveal, well, what they can do. Mr. Mouth looks at a rock and sees a dwindling inventory. I, Captain Transformus, inspired by Percival, look at the same rock and ask, what could this become once knowledge gets to work? That is the difference. Scarcity, however, is not one simple thing. We must distinguish at least three senses. First, something may be scarce because there is not much of it. There may be only a small quantity of some mineral, metal, fuel, or fertile land in a given place at a given time. Second, something may be scarce in the economist's sense because using it one way excludes using it another way. This is the scarcity of opportunity cost. The same acre of land cannot at the same moment and in the same respect be a wheat field, an airport, a forest reserve, and a housing estate. Choice entails exclusion. But there is a third and deeper sense of scarcity, the scarcity of known usefulness. A thing is scarce in this sense when our present knowledge gives it only a limited range of services. And this is the crucial point. The third kind of scarcity is not fixed by the first two. A thing may exist in small quantity, yet become vastly more useful when knowledge changes. A tiny amount of matter may perform astonishing services once incorporated into a new technology. Think of how a 1-ton satellite made of aluminium suddenly performs more efficiently the same services as millions of tons of copper wiring on the Earth. Conversely, there may be vast quantities of something that remain economically inert because no one yet knows what to do with them. Nor does opportunity cost prevent the growth of usefulness. Opportunity cost is real. One use excludes another. But knowledge changes the menu of possible uses. It creates new substitutions, new efficiencies, new instruments, new transformations, and new problem situations. It does not abolish choice, it enlarges the space within which choice operates. That is why it is misleading to picture resources merely as stocks of stuff. So many tons of copper, so many barrels of oil, so many acres of land, so many hours of sunlight. The economic value of a resource lies in the services that can be obtained from it: heat, motion, computation, transport, communication, illumination, shelter, diagnosis, entertainment, education, and countless further forms of human benefit. And those services need not be crude or merely physical. The value of an opera singer is not a lump of matter, it is a performance, an organized flow of breath, memory, training, interpretation, sound, and emotional power. The value of a congenial discussion room is not merely its walls, chairs, lights, and cups of coffee. It lies in the services it enables: attention, exchange, criticism, provocation, imagination, and perhaps the birth of a new idea. So the vital question is not how much matter do we possess. It is, what flow of future services can knowledge draw from matter energy? Popper helps here. Popper distinguished between World 1, the physical world, World 2, the world of subjective experience, and World 3, the world of objective products of the human mind: theories, arguments, problems, designs, institutions, works of art, and scientific knowledge. Resources arise through the interaction of all three. World 1 gives us the physical stuff, matter and energy. World 2 gives us people with purposes, guesses, needs, curiosity, and imagination. World 3 gives us the abstract theories that transform the possibilities. This is where Percival's use of Popper's metaphysics was so fruitful in his essay back in 1996. A resource is not merely World 1 matter, it is World 1 matter recruited by World 3 knowledge through the agency of World 2 minds. Consider the wheel. The wheel is not merely a round object, it is an idea. Principle of rotation, load bearing, friction reduction, transport, machinery, gearing, pulleys, turbines, vehicles, clocks, factories, and countless other applications. The wheel works on Earth. It can work on the moon, it can be copied indefinitely, and no one who first grasped the principle of the wheel could have foreseen all the future services into which that principle would be absorbed. Percival stressed how this undermines the population doomsayers such as Paul Ehrlich and the Mr. Mouths that follow them. Unlike a fixed plot of land, knowledge can display increasing returns. This is because some types of knowledge transform the original framework of production. This helps explain Julian Simon's insight that many so-called natural resources have become less scarce over time, not more. Human beings do not merely consume resources, free and with a progressive ethos they invent them. Population therefore is not merely a burden. More people can also mean more problem solvers, more conjectures, more criticism, more discoveries, more unexpected uses of matter. Simon pointed to Barnett and Morse's striking result, that resource scarcity generally declined over the long run. Measured by labor and capital inputs per unit of output, the total extractive sector became much less costly, and minerals showed the most dramatic fall of all. That is exactly what Mr. Mouth's fixed inventory view would not lead us to expect. But the picture is not simplistic. Forestry was the important qualification. Its costs first rose, probably because production had moved beyond the easiest and most accessible timber, requiring more labor, transport, roads, and capital. This reminds us that knowledge is not magic. It does not make every resource cheaper at every moment. The decisive question is not how many mouths are there. That is Mr. Mouth's favorite question for obvious reasons. The better question is, how many minds are free to discover new services from the world? Quantum theory gives us a dramatic example. It is not merely a set of equations in a physics textbook. It has consequences no one can fully survey. No committee, however solemn, could calculate all the future technologies, industries, instruments, and forms of wealth that may flow from it. Its economic potential outruns the imagination even of its inventors. This is because scientific knowledge has unfathomable content. Its implications and applications exceed what any person, committee, government department, or generation can fully grasp in advance. So when I say that natural resources are indefinitely expandable, I do not mean that any particular physical stock is infinite. I do not mean that opportunity cost disappears. I do not mean that we can increase the flow of services from matter and energy to any arbitrary height merely by wishing, legislating, or waving a heroic eyebrow. That would be magic. I, Captain Transformus, am not in the magic business. I mean something more precise and more powerful. The service flow obtainable from matter and energy is open-ended under the growth of knowledge. There are constraints, of course. Physics matters, energy matters, time matters, error matters, bad institutions matter, stupidity matters very much indeed. But the physical world does not arrive with a final printed list of its possible economic services. Nature does not hand us a catalogue saying, copper, 73 uses only. Silicon, please stop after semiconductors. Sunlight, no further applications permitted. Those lists are written, revised, and expanded by knowledge. Both Frank Tipler and David Deutsch have made a closely related point. No one has proposed a law of nature establishing a known upper bound to the growth of knowledge, or a known stopping point at which productive, transformative understanding must finally cease. That is the crucial issue, not whether any present resource is infinite in a crude physical sense, not whether any present technique can be pushed without limit, but whether there is a known ceiling on the growth of knowledge that creates new services, new substitutions, new transformations, and new resources. There is no such known ceiling. In his story, Gerald Moleskin, a philosophical science-fictional account of advanced aliens visiting Earth after the demise of humanity, Percival has the aliens, whose hobby is the natural history of failed civilizations, consider a paradoxical explanation for why human beings were so disastrously unprepared for extraterrestrial infection and other possible existential threats. They used resources too slowly. The truth-telling paradox is this: if a civilization uses resources rapidly enough to accelerate discovery, invention, and productive capacity, it may end up with more resources in the future than it would have had by conserving them miserly. Had coal mining, for example, been tightly regulated to a much lower rate, the Industrial Revolution could scarcely have gathered momentum. The very expenditure of resources helped create the knowledge and technologies that transformed what counted as a resource in the first place. There may be catastrophes, mistakes, failures, and long periods of stagnation. Progress is not automatic. Optimism is not a guarantee. But pessimism has no right to masquerade as realism merely because it has counted the current inventory. The current inventory is not the future of knowledge. Mr. Mouth sees the world as a warehouse running down. Captain Transformus sees it as a problem situation opening up. Matter is not enough. Mind is not enough. But when matter enters the field of criticism, imagination, and theory, the world becomes richer than pessimism can imagine. That is the metaphysics of abundance. If you enjoyed this small rebellion against gloom, kindly subscribe. It is a vote for abundance, eccentricity, and the right to enjoy the victory. And now, Panem, before we retire, Mr. Mouth once again to the ring.
I'll crush you, Transformers. Crush you.
And that, Mr. Mouth, is what happens when a slogan meets an explanation.
Recall the aliens in Ray's story? The alien historians reached a disturbing conclusion. Earth had not died simply from a shortage of matter, energy, or land, nor even from the final stroke of parasitic invasion. Beneath those failures lay something stranger, a C4 crisis. Too few minds had been free enough to save it. But what C4 means fundamentally must wait until Captain Transformus returns.
C4? Then Earth's problem was deeper than I feared.